Ashes of Victory RK equals Part 5 RK equals Victoria Halcyon, VH. In a war full of turning points, Corellia takes a special place. From the initial neutrality championed by Senator Iblis, to fully backing the war effort months later, when the war escalated. From the fall of the Corellian system to its eventual liberation. Both of our guests tonight played critical roles in those events. VH, please tell us about the liberation of Corellia, General. General Ahsoka Tano, General At, it was an eye-opening experience. I fought in many battles before, both alongside clone troopers, local defense forces, and resistance units, after the former had been destroyed in the field by the Confederacy. All those battles had something in common. The soldiers fighting beside me were either veteran combat troops with significant experience, had years if not decades of training, or they were the survivors who made it through everything the Confederacy could throw at them. In contrast, at Corellia, I commanded one of the most experienced units we deployed planetside. They were good soldiers. Some of the best men and women I've ever had the privilege to serve with. They were also painfully green compared to any other unit I fought beside or led before Corellia. I can't stress that point enough. And everyone else who landed and fought with us and the core SEC's remaining formations on Corellia was even greener. We knew those troops needed at least a few more months of training at best, much longer at worst. However, we were out of time. 4 of the 5 brothers had fallen at that point, Starhammer worked, and Admiral Trench had to retreat, giving us a priceless opportunity to recover many of our worlds. We had to take it for many reasons. So we deployed. Imperial Senator Garmbel Iblis is GBI, and it went downhill from there. The liberation of Corellia was a bloodbath. Liberating all 5 brothers was worse, and all that was a taste of things to come. VH, you're talking about the liberation of the rest of the core. General At, by the time of the Black Rebellion, we weren't even halfway through. There were dozens of worlds with large active droid armies on them and hundreds of commando units operating behind our lines causing havoc. Is GBI, as they say, the rest is bloody history. VH, you're correct, Senator. We're here tonight to talk about the liberation of Corellia and how it affected the war in the following months. RK equals Acclimator Assault Ship Remember Camino. High orbit above Corellia, Corellian system. Painful experience pointed at a simple and logical fact. The first waves of an orbital drop suffered the most casualties, especially when conducted against relatively intact air defense networks. Thus, the command staff of a shock trooper was no longer permitted to be among the first to launch and hit the ground. This simple fact allowed Ahsoka more time to absorb the sheer scale of the operation she was now part of. Nearly 100 acclimators moved like one, coordinated by battle network, untouched by enemy electronic war assets. They merely carried the first wave of units to hit the ground. Far behind them, conventional transports under heavy guard waited for secure landing sites and the suppression of all ground-to-orbit emplacements that might be able to threaten those converted freighters. Hundreds of ships surrounded the acclimators. From the largest supercapitals to humble corvettes. Venottas and dedicated carriers launched intact wings of fighters and bombers, which soon formed up and accelerated towards the atmosphere. Limited and light ion cannon bombardment gave a few separatist units something else to worry about. Unfortunately, this was Corellia, a densely populated core world. In many places, the enemy operated within densely populated areas, which often couldn't be properly evacuated before the droids took them. In the rare cases when there weren't civilians to worry about, the enemy was protected by shields, and overwhelming those with firepower would require enough of it to glass whole regions, at best. That was out of the question. The acclimators shifted and advanced just as nearly 10,000 small craft hit the atmosphere. 10 assault ships began launching their drop pods, while the rest unleashed a swarm of gunships, LART transports, and assault shuttles. More fighters and bombers left their motherships and formed around the more vulnerable troop transports. Half of the acclimators followed suit and advanced as well. There was no response yet. The separatists on the ground knew what was coming for them. They had to know for hours now. Whatever nasty surprises they had waiting for the Republic troops remained silent and ready. A countdown reached 0, and Ahsoka's pod shook, rattling her, despite the inertial dampeners and shock-absorbing gel surrounding her. The fourth wave was on the way. The fifth and last would load and launch 60 seconds later. It wasn't until the first wave of drop pods was a mere 30 seconds from hitting their targets when the enemy finally revealed their hand. They had endured the initial air and orbital strikes hiding behind their shields or using concealment to avoid detection. Hundreds of missiles, then thousands, rose to meet the fighters and bombers swarming above Coronet City. Thousands of upgraded Vulture droids launched from concealed positions, and countless laser cannons lit up the skies. A shower of burning decoys, false images, and the siren songs of E-war pods lured sensors and weapons towards false targets. It wasn't enough. Odd missiles, lucky laser bolts, and eager vultures began murdering Ahsoka's people. Light escorts entered the atmosphere above them, adding their jamming and E-war capabilities in a desperate attempt to blind enemy targeting sensors. Shock troopers kept dying. Fighters and bombers flew among the dropping pods, fighting for their lives. Ahsoka saw a Y-wing dodging as wildly as it could. The bomber's rear gunner shot desperately at 4 missiles chasing it. One of the warheads detonated, damaging a second missile, which veered off course and exploded harmlessly. The other 2 struck true. One sheared off an engine pod, while the other slammed into the rear gunner and turned the cockpit into a burning coffin. A vulture nearly took out Ahsoka's pod. However, it fortunately only blew up a few of the decoys flying around her. Its passage shook her to the bone, and the Jedi saw the reason why she was still alive. A Torrent fighter chased the vulture, followed by 2 more droid fighters. The Torrent shot down its prey before being sliced in 2 by the pursuing fighters. A missile came from above, blowing up one vulture in an impressive explosion. The second one dove, going after a cluster of pods, while a pair of Torrents flew by Ahsoka's prod and gave chase. Far below her, Coronet City, the Jewel of Corellia, was dark, lit up only by weapon discharges, explosions, and uncontrolled fires. What was left from her first wave decelerated sharply, burning out repulsor pods and straining out inertial dampeners to their breaking point. Only 2 companies of Ahsoka's 1st Battalion made it more or less intact to the ground. They wasted no time in attempting to regroup or search for cover. There was no time for such luxuries, and overwhelming numbers of droids were already converging on their locations. Instead, the shock troopers used the capabilities of their armors to their utmost and went after the nearest AA emplacements or shield generators they could detect. While their suicidal attack didn't do much to help the second wave, which suffered nearly as much, the third wave reached the ground relatively intact. As did the fourth and the fifth. Ahsoka's pod peeled off, adding even more clutter and false targets for any targeting sensors guiding weapons after her. It was only now, when she could finally do something about it, that Ahsoka let go from the clamp she had been holding on her emotions. Fear, exhilaration, and rage flooded her veins and for a moment, nearly overwhelmed her before she focused them to a razor edge, like that bitch Sash taught her. A large explosion lit up whole districts of Coronet City, bathing it in red light. Briefly, Ahsoka saw how much the metropolis had suffered since the fall of the Corellian systems. Ravaged pace scrapers rose in the air like gnarled, skeletal fingers trying to grasp salvation. Broken skyscrapers and smaller buildings stretched to the horizon like the burned-out husks of a forest after an inferno. Ahsoka could see and feel the fighting taking place below. She could bathe in the fear and desperation of the millions of civilians cut off at the heart of the megapolis. And finally, she could do something about it. The world around Ahsoka slowed down as the Force coldly enhanced her perception and reflexes. Frozen fingers kept the Jedi's emotions under her control, so she could use them as fuel, yet not let them control her actions. Her people didn't need an idealistic Jedi, neither a raging maniac who let herself be overwhelmed by her own emotions. They needed cold and crisp professionalism to get them through this hell, and Ahsoka was going to deliver, even if it was the last thing she would ever do. She let her training and the Force guide her body, popping up shots at targets of opportunity and weaving around the incoming fire using her secondary repulsor pod. Meanwhile, Ahsoka's mind absorbed the nearly overwhelming information coming through the combat network connecting her with her regiment, and she began issuing precise orders. The third wave was already on the ground, reasonably intact and forming up. The fourth, hers, would touch down within seconds, and it was largely intact as well. While terrible, the initial casualties weren't as bad as they could have been. She had a mostly intact regiment, her support units were coming down right behind them. Now, it was up to Ahsoka to make it all work. RK equals Part 6 RK equals Coronet City, Corellia. One of the first lessons Ahsoka learned in the academy was that as an officer, her job was to command. Ideally, she wouldn't be using her weapons unless for self-defense, or to take out a target she believed one of her subordinates wouldn't be able to service in time. As a Jedi, she was a special case. There might be objectives that could require her ability with the Force to achieve promptly, if at all. However, it would be her job to determine if going after such objectives was worth it, instead of sending her people to try and complete them, while she hung back and commanded. That was the theory, anyway. The real world often had other ideas. As soon as Ahsoka hit the ground, multiple new jammers came online, cutting off all communications at anything past point-blank range. So much for properly rallying and commanding her regiment. A brief burst of anger burns through her defenses before she used it as fuel, and her mind returned to the cold, crystal clarity. First, cover. The colonel's training, both as an officer and a Jedi, kicked in, and she darted towards a nearby ruined building. Droids crawled out of it. Others appeared from side streets or even burst out of the cracked and bombed-out ground. More signatures came to life all around Ahsoka, high up on the nearby buildings. They lit up her HUD, and for a second, all she could hear was the piercing wail announcing the deadly touch of targeting sensors. The alarm cut off to a dull buzz, muzzled by the smart programs helping run Ahsoka's armor. That was small comfort for the Jedi. She sprinted forward as fast as her legs and the Force could carry her. Her rifle's kicks were little more than love taps against her shoulder. Ahsoka didn't bother to aim properly. She let the Force guide her, and the results spoke for themselves. Droids fell as fast as the blaster bolts could touch them, only for two or more to replace them. Despite all her advantages, Ahsoka would have died on that forsaken street if she was alone. Fortunately, for her, shock troopers were landing all over the area and converging into steadily growing clusters. The lucky ones, anyway. There was little the colonel could do when she saw one of her soldiers land right in front of the building that was her target, appearing on the path of a small buzz droid swarm. The poor bastard had just enough time to scream before a couple of dozen of the little horrors fell upon him and began to cut. Ahsoka stumbled, acutely feeling the man's pain and terror. It cracked her mental defenses. For a moment, she could feel a miasma of misery and despair, of pain and loss, that clung to this part of the city. Blaster bolts splashed over her shields, collapsing them. She surged forward, avoiding a hail of fire that landed on the spot of burned-out ground she just left. A furious tug of the Force was all it took to activate all the grenades carried by the dead soldier. A moment later, his funeral pyre consumed his murderers and cleared the front of the building. Ahsoka vaulted through the smoke of the explosion, ignoring the shrapnel that bounced off her armor. She angrily slammed her rifle to its magnetic clamp and rolled through a demolished wall. The furious Jedi rose, holding her lightsaber in a Sorisu stance while clutching a smoke grenade in her left hand. 5 droids of different models immediately opened fire on Ahsoka. A dark commando droid and dull grey super battle one were to her right, pumping shot after shot at the colonel, while she weaved between the blaster bolts or deflected them back. The large grey machine collapsed, its chassis melted by its shot. The commando managed to jump back, avoiding the reflected shots. Ahsoka threw the smoke grenade at the B-1, which collapsed, its head taken out by the small object. That still left the 2 droids to her left, which burned through her recharging shields and carved through the upper ablative layer of her armor. The colonel could feel more and more of her people dying. Familiar force signatures flickered into her distorted range only to blink out with spikes of pain, hate, and the odd stunning surprise brushing past her mind. Ahsoka grit her teeth, feeling the metallic taste of blood in her mouth. Her control cracked further, and she let out a single, focused scream. The commando droid shattered upon a fractured metal wall. The 2 odd machines shooting Ahsoka in the back froze, held firmly by her telekinetic grip. She spared a heartbeat to glare at them, before crushing their spindly forms into balls of scrap. There was no time for pointless fury, no matter if that was the Jedi way or not. Ahsoka shook herself, pushing aside the resentment smoldering within her heart over Zash's influence, even if it might come in useful. More of her people were landing with every passing moment, and they needed leadership. They needed a way to communicate, and that was the most important part. She had to hunt down as many jammers and shield generators as possible, then rally her troops before the enemy could overrun them. With a clear goal burning within her mind, Ahsoka charged through the building, seeking a vantage point on the roof. She didn't point pausing to regain proper control. Instead, she used the droids daring to stand in her way as a means to vent. The building shook from inside as she ran through like a hurricane, leaving smoking piles of scrap in her wake. Then it shook from outside, when a large dark form slammed into the abused street, shattering whatever was left of it. Smaller, brighter forms landed in a rough circle around the tank. Its shield came online with a noticeable distortion of the air, and multiple pods at the back of the cupola opened, uncovering sensor pods. The DOS tank wasn't trying to hide, on the contrary. It was making itself a very noticeable and big target. All the while its onboard computers searched for jammers and the distinctive power spikes of shield generators. It worked too. Within seconds, many of the droids in the area shifted their aim to the tank, bombarding it with blaster bolts and launching missiles. Multiple repeaters spoke back, slating ordnance in mid-flight. The behemoth didn't stay idle. Its engine roared, and its large tracks ground the street to dust as it accelerated much faster than anything that big should have been able to. Its main cannon spoke in anger, sending a blood-red dart of energy downstreet. Secondary weapons kept spiting their defiance in the air, even as more missiles converged on the tank. The DOS infantry wasn't idle either. They spread out and began to systematically dismantle all droids in range. The distraction was what Ahsoka's scattered troopers needed to rally, and soon, individuals linked into makeshift squads to advance towards the closest target they could find. The Jedi burst out on the roof and used the Force to sweep it clear of enterprising droids. She never ceased moving, while her head snapped in all directions, taking stock of the situation in the area. Fighters and bombers dueled in the skies above. More pods came screaming from orbit, this time mostly carrying supplies and vital laser communicators. The latter should allow the ground forces to keep in touch with the fleet above no matter what happened. That was the good news. The bad was obvious as well and varied. Enemy fire streamed down from most tall buildings in the area. Droids swarmed from hiding holes all over the place and did their best to overwhelm Ahsoka's people before they could consolidate and put up a proper defense. She could see fighting in the distance as well, far away from the regiment's deployment zone. That had to be the cut-off locals. They were either desperately counter-attacking. More likely, now that the enemy no longer needed them to act as bait, the Separatists were doing their damned best to remove them from the equation. And there was no doubt in Ahsoka's mind now. The Corellians encircled in their capital were nothing more than bait dangled by the Separatists. Tens of thousands of soldiers, millions of civilians, reduced to the means to get her people killed. And they were dying now when the enemy deemed them no longer useful. That was one straw too many. Perhaps it was the strain of the past months, of everything that has happened since the Jedi coup. Undoubtedly, Zash's teachings had a lot to do with it as well. Something broke within Ahsoka. It wasn't out of malice or mere unreasonable hatred. It was righteous indignation that finally pushed her over the edge. Her control shattered like a glass window hit by a speeding air car. Ahsoka could feel all the pain and suffering, all the lives snuffed out before their time in Coronet City. Many of them were those of her people, and they were her responsibility. She was drowning in fury and helplessness, for what could she do to help them? Ahsoka was seemingly alone at that moment, and it felt like that all the droids she could perceive were busy crawling her way like a tidal wave of machine horrors. Her mind grasped for a solution, while Ahsoka drowned in her rampaging emotions. A solution she soon grasped, in Zash's teachings. It was as if the infernal woman knew something like this would happen, and prepared, waiting for an opportunity for her lessons to find fertile ground. Ahsoka ceased trying to stave off or control her emotions. She let them run free through her for endless moments while reveling in every single one of them. Then, just like she had been taught, she grasped them with a supreme effort of will and channeled them. Her fury was her weapon. Her fear was a shield. Her worry turned into fuel. The chaos of combat stilled around the colonel, no longer suffocating her. She looked at the battlefield with new eyes, cold, calculating, and analytical. She couldn't save all her people. No matter what she did, hundreds, no, thousands, were going to die. And if she fell apart again, all would be lost. First, her soldiers needed time to regroup and recover. Time she was going to buy them by any means necessary. The Force was no longer her ally, shielding her from harm. It was her weapon, the blade she would wield to protect her soldiers. The Force was her power, and for the first time in her life, Ahsoka unleashed it, fueling it with all her being, and struck, holding nothing back. Her first target was a nearby ravaged skyscraper used by the enemy to rain hell upon her troopers. Ahsoka focused all she had and struck near the foundation, slicing through reinforcing metal with her will alone. Thick slabs of metal splintered as if they were little more than weak wood, and 50 stores of empty offices and malicious droids fell to their doom. Ashes of Victory =RK Part 7 =RK. From a military perspective, Operation Starhammer was an unmitigated success. It achieved all of its stated realistic tactical and strategic goals. In the course of the operation, GAR managed to recover a significant amount of CIS-held territory in the core with little to no fighting in space, ravage the industry of numerous Confederate worlds and neutralize them as a credible threat for years to come, all the while suffering acceptable casualties. In theory, the same was true politically. Sadly, that wasn't the case in practice. First, the success of Operation Starhammer demonstrated what the shattered Republic could still achieve when united in purpose. If anything, this success should have been a shining beacon to rally support around. It was the last credible opportunity to save the Republic. Second, it proved that many politicians across the Republic were right to put their trust in GAR High Command's decision-making. That boosted support and popularity for the military and those backing it. Third, after the string of disasters following the Confederate Grand Offensive that brought the Republic to its knees, the tides were finally changing in a way the people, and more importantly, politicians in the Corps, could see and feel it. Fourth, it strengthened the position of Chancellor Satine Kenobi, increasing the legitimacy of the Republic remnant she led. Unfortunately, even the stunning, revitalizing success of Operation Starhammer was insufficient to reunite the shattered Republic. While the operation was still ongoing, General Kenobi personally oversaw the bloody liberation of the Corellian system. General Vale, Mandalore himself, chased Admiral Trench and the bulk of the Confederate fleet. That should have been a moment of triumph. Instead, political disagreement already threatened to tear the Republic asunder. Sadly, the success of Operation Starhammer did have negative political consequences as well. It strengthened the position of General Vale as one of the most dangerous military commanders of the era, and increased the public support he enjoyed, despite his controversial bloody actions to date. Various elements within the Republic leadership saw him as an emerging threat. General Vale was a threat his detractors believed they had to contain at worst and neutralize at best. According to the general's political enemies, he caused almost as much damage to the fabric of the Republic as he did to the Confederacy. That was a bold statement, with some merit. We know for a fact that it was due to General Vale's actions, and very existence, that multiple systems declared neutrality, outright seceded, or even joined the Confederacy. They did it in the dubious hope that it would protect them from the Mandalorians and the Sith. Even before Operation Star Hammer was fully complete, Republic member states hurried to recall their contribution to the GAR. They cited the heavy losses suffered by their naval elements and blamed General Vale for it. Further, a significant number of states made it clear that they would not be providing any more direct military support for offensive operations. At least not until they could rebuild their system defense navies. That was something that would realistically take years and likely wouldn't happen before the war was either over, or all but won. In practical terms, this meant that the GAR would be unable to seriously consider further offensives against the Confederacy, and left the question of Mandalore hanging in the air. As Mandalore himself, General Vale had little option politically speaking, but to attempt to liberate the heart of his power base. The GAR was stretched thin once again. It was forced to deploy and supply ground armies all over the core, eating into the ships available for deployment. The need to push to the Mid-Rim Alliance and relieve it didn't help in that matter, leaving precious little for General Vale to deploy to Mandalore. As if that wasn't bad enough, there were all kinds of indicators that the CIS was laying a trap for him there. Arguably, these actions were the final nails into the Republic's coffin. They ensured that some of the most powerful figures fighting for the Republic no longer viewed it as worth saving and had to make other plans for the future. The Mandalorian question was especially critical, considering that the Supreme Chancellor was Mandalorian herself. Her husband, General Kenobi, GAR's Supreme Commander, became one after their marriage. Of course, we had General Vale, Mandalore himself, soon to become known as the Restorer. The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Republic, Carrington Byron, Ariadu Publishing Corporation, =RK FOB Respite, Coronet City Suburbs, Corellia. General Pascal Victus leaned over a flickering holotable, studying real-time intelligence flowing in from all around the front. It was painfully obvious that their original assessment of enemy strength was widely optimistic. The same went for the Separatists' intentions. A combination of shields, the hellish cityscape, and countless strong points built by the enemy, made Coronet a tough nut to crack. As if that wasn't bad enough, there were pockets of civilians scattered all over the area. After the first few hours of chaotic and deadly fighting, it became crystal clear that salvaging anything of the local infrastructure was out of the question. The only two factors limiting the deployment of the heaviest weapons available were the shields and the civilians. The old Corellian veteran looked up from the interactive map to the cluster of holographic faces hanging above it. We must face the facts. The Separatists succeeded us into a trap, baiting us to strike into a prepared death ground. They already chewed through my lead divisions trying to break through. I had to order them back to recover and incorporate replacements. Under the present circumstances, I lack tactical options that won't result in a bloodbath, either for our assaulting formations, or those trapped within Coronet. The Dictat, General Hughes, and General Kenobi, along with a smattering of division commanders, looked down at the map, evaluating his words and the tactical situation. The Jedi closed his eyes and lowered his head for a few seconds, before raising it. His eyes shone with something dangerous when he spoke. I'll personally lead the next assault using my abilities to give our soldiers an edge. Shuffle forces for pinning attacks all over the perimeter. Concentrate armored units with heavy infantry support on the following locations. The map shifted, highlighting 3 of the main boulevards leading towards the center of the city. They were covered with minefields. Dozens, if not hundreds, interlocking fields of fire covered those routes. They came from buildings turned into fortresses. We'll be primarily using hovercraft vehicles. They will be able to move after we modify the terrain to our needs, Kenobi sighed. Dictat, I'm afraid that if we're to save our trapped people in Coronet, we'll have to demolish our way through your capital, fast. We'll blast our way through any resistance, and use our attacks as a cover for all available special forces to go after shield generators and jamming emitters. At this point, I must request that you allow the deployment of clone commando units at Coronet. Their presence and expertise will make our job easier." Dictat Mericope glanced at General Hughes, then looked back at Kenobi. "I'll get back to you on that. Please continue with your plan, General Kenobi. Once we have some of the shields neutralized, we will utilize acclimators for close-in air support. Their primary purpose will be to help us burn ourselves a secure evacuation corridor. Attempting to conventionally storm through hundreds of buildings at this time would both ensure a bloodbath we can't afford. Doing so will take too much time, ensuring the destruction of the cut-off forces." General Victus wasn't surprised by the argument that followed, even if Kenobi was right. Taking Coronet the hard way was out of the question. Ideally, they would have besieged it until the droids no longer had the power reserves to keep their shields operational. After that it would be simple, they would deploy all the ionic weaponry they could. Of course, even then, the price of burned-down electronics in the whole city would be staggering, just nothing in comparison to fighting through it conventionally. Unfortunately, all the civilians and military units cut off in Coronet Center made that option morally and politically unfeasible. Arcade Coronet City, Corellia. Ahsoka couldn't remember how they fought their way to the broken Corellian lines in the city center. There were impressions, smells, and pictures burned into her mind, yet no coherent picture. Just one horror show after another. All she could recall were desperate engagements, followed by a hasty retreat or desperate counterattack. She did recall the last clash. 2 scratch companies made by scattered survivors of her Void Stalkers, Anaxian Rangers, and Durst shock troopers, led by 3 battered tanks. That was all Ahoska had under her direct command at the time. They fell on the back of a droid assault busy chewing through the last coherent defense line the locals had. The enemy managed to breach it, only to die in a glorious conflagration, struck from 3 sides. At that point, Ahsoka had dispensed with any illusions and self-deception. She had fallen, she knew it, and didn't care. Sith lighting was extremely useful against droids. Frying the damned machines was cathartic, not to mention, it saved dozens of her people over the last few hours of fighting. Now, she had to figure out how to keep the rest of them alive until reinforcements could reach them. The survivors were busy digging in front of a large, battered government building. 2 worse for where star scrapers flanked it, still held by core sec elements. That by itself made for a good defensive position. Unfortunately, there was little coherent resistance standing between this strong point and a large camp holding a few million locals. Many of those were either children, elderly, wounded, or sick, and thus, unable to be useful for the defense. Those who could, and were willing to fight, apparently did so, and were one of the reasons why the broken core sec military formations in the area held as long as they did. That, and the fact that they were all more useful as bait than dead, Ahsoka thought resentfully. "Focus, girl, focus," Ahsoka muttered to herself. She could hear the dark side whisper to her. Her thoughts were a jumble, angry and violent, exactly what she didn't need right now. She had to inspire the defenders, to hold them together, instead of appearing as a young commander broken and driven insane by the madness of combat. No matter how much the latter was true, she thought bitterly. She bit the inside of her cheek, drawing blood and using the pain to focus. "Sergeant." Ahsoka paused and glanced at the heavy-armored Durst shadowing her. Dead, she finally recalled. "Find me the ranking Corellian commander. We need to know what we have to work with here." Then her eyes went to the highest-ranking Void Stalker officer they had in their group, beside her. "Lieutenant Kyle, set up a laser comm, and get in touch with the fleet. We'll need all the support we can get. Have the Navy coordinate with any other survivors of our units and vector them in our way." RK Part 8 RK Coronet City, Corellia. A treacherous voice asked Obi-Wan what he thought he was doing. He was a Jedi, wasn't he? Or at least, that was what he claimed, even in front of a mirror in the fresher. He chose to walk this bloody path, again and again. Yet these thoughts, this doubt, didn't perish. They were his constant companion, and deep down, Kenobi knew why. It was all wrong. Not just the pure insanity here on Corellia, but the madness infecting the whole galaxy. Obi-Wan was supposed to be a Jedi, a peacekeeper, and a diplomat, not a general. He should be fighting to end the war, to stop the constant damned bloodshed. Instead, here he was, sitting on top of a DRS-heavy tank, ready to lead an assault that was going to be mind-bogglingly bloody. Kenobi's doubt flared up, doing its best to paralyze him with indecision. He knew what that meant. For a long time now, such indecision crept upon him again and again, no matter how many times he kept choosing his current path. The reason was painfully simple too. There was a part of him that simply knew that what he was doing was wrong. Deep down, he knew that the Order was right about how dangerous attachments were. Obi-Wan was keenly aware that now, he was the poster child for what happens when someone puts attachments in front of the common good. He was also a proof of how dangerous they could be. Yet, at the same time, there has been nothing more right in his life than Satine and their unborn child. When all was said and done, no matter how right the Jedi Order might have been about certain things, it proved itself catastrophically wrong about others. What concerned Obi-Wan was how disregarding and pushing away his doubts became easier and easier every time they reared up their ugly heads. There were countless justifications he could use, and most of them would be valid. In the end, Kenobi made his choice and didn't regret it. Or did he? That should have been it. Then again, how could not feel it had all gone wrong, when he was about to order countless soldiers to their deaths? If he walked away, someone else would do it. Or not, and doom the galaxy to separatist dominance, and inevitably, another round of wars once there was no enemy to unite the Confederacy. No, that was once again a mere justification, Obi-Wan decided. Was he doing the right thing for the wrong reasons or the wrong thing, for the right ones? At that point, he figured he missed all the paperwork and pressure of command. Right now, Obi-Wan could do little more than stand as a symbol and wait for the go order, while General Victus ensured everyone was in position before giving it. The Corellian had tactical and operational command over the coming battle. While Kenobi helped plan it, he had no business trying to command from the tip of the spear, where his abilities might have more of an impact. It was in these rare moments, Obi-Wan must when his doubt came back in full force. Or was it his conscience? Another treacherous and unwelcome thought came unbidden. That was a torture of an unexpected kind. Who would have thought that falling could be such a slow and painful process? There was a small part of him that yearned for it to happen already, so doubt would no longer plague him. Kenobi could remember the good old days when he was blind to the truth of the Republic and those who ran it. Those were simpler, kinder times. Just a few years ago, he had a clarity of vision and purpose. There was no doubt, then. There was no anger in his heart, much less hatred. No, that was another lie, Obi-Wan told himself. He knew both those emotions, ever since Naboo when Maul murdered Qui-Gon. Yet, then they didn't fester. For most intents and purposes, those emotions within his heart died with the Sith apprentice. Now, there were many people and organizations Obi-Wan had reasons to be angry and frustrated with or even outright hate. There were things he feared losing, doing, or becoming. In hindsight, Obi-Wan decided that he should have been a better Jedi, a better teacher, and a friend. He should have served a better order, and they shouldn't have let things spiral out of control to this extent. It was just that, there was no point pondering such what-ifs. The past was set in stone, and he had to live the consequences. T-4. A pleasant female voice announced over the battle net. Obi-Wan perked up. Soon, there would be no more time or place for doubt. Perhaps, he would find some clarity of purpose and false peace in the coming battle. Kenobi looked around, burning into his mind a picture of those about to die. The large boulevard was packed with soldiers and machines, a perfect target for artillery or airstrikes. A glimmering theater shield protected them from such threats, just like identical devices ensured the safety of the enemy. There would be no finesse or space to maneuver. Now whole armies were little more than blunt instruments. This was the perfect moment to have expendable units. Like droids, or damningly, clones. Ironically enough, most available clones were now valuable veterans. They were arguably less expendable than the masses of volunteers ready to charge the separatist lines. The very fact that Obi-Wan could now think in such terms was a testament to how much the war had already warped him, and he knew, this wasn't the end. T-3. The distinct dull sound of a heavy repulsor lifts in action carried out over the subdued capital. Obi-Wan looked up and saw several acclamators glided through the air, keeping to the protection of the theater shields. The enemy had proton cannon emplacements ready to fend off even capital ships at short range. Until neutralized, they would heavily restrict the use of precise support from the warships. That was a moot point anyway, at least until the enemy shields were up and running. Obi-Wan steeled himself for the bloodbath to come. Ice crept up his spine, a telltale sign of the dark side's touch. There was a time he would have instinctively rejected it. Before that, there was a time that the dark side wouldn't have reached out to him. That was yet another shattered illusion, like the one that they lived in a civilized age. 2 years of war made sure everyone knew better, and the galaxy was poorer for it. T-2. Deploying concealment rounds. Lead assault elements, prepare to breach the enemy theater shields. Low thumps echoed through Coronet's canyons. Various engines came to full power. The small no man's land between the opposing armies exploded in silver metallic smoke. More and more concealment rounds detonated, and soon the smoke spread like quickly growing fog, blinding eyes and senses alike. T-1. First echelon advance. Dozens of heavy tanks and IFVs roared and slowly moved forward, each followed by at least a couple of infantry squads clad in medium and heavy armor. They used the vehicles as cover, and hopefully, it might just be enough to survive passing through the point of contact. Obi-Wan wasn't in the first echelon. Everyone agreed that his skills would be wasted in the point-blank ferocious fighting that would ensure there. He was back with the third echelon, meant to exploit a breach into the enemy's forward defensive lines. The army's vanguard vanished into the smoke and soon met resistance. Blasters, railguns, missiles, and mines went off. A constant stream of explosions lit up the mist in all colors of the rainbow, giving it a hellish look. All the while, concealment rounds kept raining on the battlefield, intentionally cutting down visibility to as close to zero as possible. That was a picture repeating itself all over the front, all to make breaching the enemy shields a little bit less expensive. They needed droids for this, Obi-Wan knew. Within moments of the attack's start, he could feel a constant wave of violent deaths washing over him. The casualties were already unacceptably high, and they were just beginning the bloody assault. The only dubious mercy was that he couldn't see with his eyes the hell unfolding right in front of him. Not yet, anyway.